Well, welcome everyone to the final session of the Herbert C. Kelman seminar. And we are thrilled to present this wonderful talk with one of our colleagues from the Fletcher School, Dr. Tamirace Fakhoury. Hope I said that right. I'm thrilled because we're ending the semester with such a great note. We're talking about EU Tamirace is talking about the EU and its role in conflict resolution. And so thank you all. I know we've got people from all over the world here joining us. We love it that you're all so interested in the Herbert C. Kelman seminar. He would be delighted to know that you're all here in his name and under his watch. So yes, let me just say that my name is Donna Hicks. I'm the chair of the seminar. We co-sponsor this seminar, the Program on Negotiation at Harvard Law School, and the Weatherhead Center for International Affairs here at Harvard. And as I said, we have this wonderful speaker, and I will introduce her in just a minute. But before that, I would just want to say that thank you to our team. We've got a great team. We've had a wonderful semester, and they have been behind the scenes. CJ Bigsby, Luis Reyes, and my co-partner, also Nicole Bryant, we're all together in this, and we have had such a wonderful time this semester, and appreciate you're all tuning in. So the format, as you may know, is I will introduce Dr. Fakhoury, and we will give her about 40 minutes to present her ideas, and after which we'll have a Q&A. And please put your questions in the Q&A function, not in chat, because we don't use chat for Q&A. So put it in the Q&A. And also, if for some reason you know someone who might really enjoy listening to this, who wasn't able to make it today, we are recording it. So give us a couple of days, go on the Program on Negotiation website, and it'll be there. Click on events. So yes, so thanks to our team, thanks to everybody, thanks to PON, to Weatherhead Center. And without further ado, I'm going to introduce our speaker today. Professor Tamirace Fakhoury is an associate professor of international politics and conflict at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts. And her research explores the politics of power sharing as a central framework for conflict resolution after war. Her work also engages with the politics of refugee and migration in complex conflict environments. Additionally, she studies the role of multilateral actors, such as the European Union, in shaping global responses to conflict. Before joining Fletcher, she was an associate professor at Aalborg University in Copenhagen, Denmark, and a visiting professor as well at the Kuwait Chair of Sciences in Paris. So we are so happy to host this wonderful talk and this wonderful professor. So I am just going to turn it over to you, Professor Fakhoury.
Thank you.
And
Thank you
I'm
so
going to
much.
disappear. I'm going to disappear.
Thank you so much, Donna. Thank you for the kind introductions, and thank you for having me. It's such a pleasure to be able to share my research on this platform. Allow me to share my screen. So in today's talk, I want to take you on a quick journey into a question that sits really right at the heart of both policy debates and academic research. How does the European Union actually behave when it's confronted with conflicts and conflict spillovers? I will begin by laying out the analytical lens through which I approach the EU's role. Then I will walk you through concrete examples of how the EU engages in conflicts and their spillovers. After some concluding remarks and takeaways, I hope we can open up a conversation about what these patterns reveal about the EU's role in a strained multilateral order. So let me start with the big question. Why does the European Union, long celebrated as a soft power and a normative force for good, struggle to act as a strong and coherent global actor in conflicts? And can it really be described as an effective conflict resolution actor today? Or is it better understood as an actor that manages, contains, or at times even disengages from conflicts? This question has really become the elephant in the room of contemporary European foreign policy. It's also central to scholarly debates about whether the EU can meaningfully contribute to conflict transformation or more modestly to conflict regulation. As we all know, the EU is really a complex regional organization with 27 member states. It navigates a world marked by protracted conflicts, authoritarian resurgence, and the erosion of international norms. Its external action today is increasingly defined by dilemmas rather than clear direction or orientation. Defense spending versus development aid, human rights versus security, prioritizing engagement in near versus distant crises, and the limits of enlargement to Eastern Europe or to the East as a tool of influence. Beyond this, the EU's migration policy has become a core instrument of its foreign and security policy. EU's reliance on externalization, i.e. outsourcing migration control to third countries, has further exposed the tensions between its rhetoric and its practices. This has accelerated, according to some analysts, the erosion of EU normative power. Let me first set the stage so we can better understand the environment in which the EU operates today. We hear it really every day, but it's worth repeating it here. We live in a world where, to borrow the famous line, the center does not hold. Conflicts are on the rise, and resolving them is becoming more difficult than ever. Humanitarian funding is at an all-time low, and not since the end of World War II have so many global powers been directly engaged in conflict. In these last years, we have seen the outbreak of lethal and asymmetrical conflicts that risk becoming protracted. Some even say that the future of peace building seems to lie in its past. And strategists are really struggling to define the era we live in today. Some of the questions that arise in the literature are we witnessing the return of geopolitics, or has the international system always been, in essence, a jungle? Is the rules-based post-1945 liberal order collapsing, shifting, eroding, or was it never fully there in the first place, given how contested it has always been? So how do we frame our epoch? The predecessor of the EU, the EEC, the European Economic Community, was born in the 1950s at a moment of institutional proliferation, great promise, and an explosion of treaties. There was a strong belief in a benevolent multilateral world order after the horrors of World War II. Today, however, we all know that experts reach for a very different vocabulary. We hear about messy multilateralism, withdrawal multilateralism, and even aggressive multilateralism. There's broad agreement that multilateral cooperation over conflicts is under strain, and that the EU is well dealing now with the transatlantic rift, having to find new partners and allies. Also, in recent years, we have seen a persistent pattern of inaction on conflict management at the multilateral level. Think of the Security Council gridlocked over Syria or over Ukraine. Think of the polarization surrounding the Israel-Hamas war. Even the UN-brokered Black Sea Grain Initiative, behind which European powers threw their weight and which was hailed in 2022 as a diplomatic success, unraveled. So against this backdrop, the EU has been confronted with the proliferation of ad hoc conflict management coalitions and powers that sometimes choose to operate outside traditional multilateral negotiation tracks. Consider Turkey, but also China and Brazil putting forth peace plans for Ukraine. So the EU finds itself operating in a fragmenting or a crowded conflict management marketplace, really one actor among many. More recently, for the EU, one of the most important critical junctures, or better said, game changers, has been indeed the war on Ukraine. Why this war in particular? Yes, it's happening on Europe's territory, but for the sake of our talk today, it's important to highlight that it shattered many of the assumptions that shaped the EU's belief in socializing states into peaceful behavior. It challenged the EU's idea that the multilateral, rules-based world order could deter large-scale interstate war. So Russia's invasion of Ukraine shook the EU profoundly. The war specifically challenged the EU's conflict transformation logic. For decades, the EU operated under the assumption that, first, socializing states into EU norms, and second, encouraging business and economic ties with the state would prevent, radical or destructive behavior. So the war in Ukraine put the German slogan, change through trade or Wandel durch Handel, to the test. It also prompted a broader rethinking of where the EU and its member states are heading, what their security and defense policies should look like by 2030, and what they should prioritize. Think of Germany redeploying troops after decades of restraint. Think of Denmark reinvesting massively in its security and defense strategy. Think of Sweden and Finland applying to join NATO in 2022, ending an era of neutrality. And to the surprise of many, Sweden even revoked its feminist foreign policy. So what we see in the aftermath of the war on Ukraine is really a deep rethinking of EU priorities for the years ahead. So what does this all tell us about how the EU thinks about itself as a conflict resolution actor and how it actually fares in practice? This is the question I'm interested in. So to answer that, I want to take a step back and look at how the EU projects an image of itself as a global conflict resolution actor. And then I want to show you how this image holds up when confronted with real-world crises and conflicts. To do that, I'm going to turn to two regional case studies, Syria and Iran. These cases are especially revealing, I would argue, because the EU has long been one of the most important third-party conflict resolution actors in the Middle East. So how it behaves here, the choices it makes, the dilemmas it faces, the path dependencies it cannot escape, tells us a great deal about the EU's role in the world and the kind of global actor it is and that it will become. Globally, the EU understands its role in alleviating and transforming conflicts as broad and comprehensive. Through its external action, it strives, at least in rhetoric, not only towards negative peace, i.e. bringing hostilities to an end, but also positive, or what we call emancipatory peace. This is about addressing deeper conflict drivers and building the foundations for sustainable peace and conflict transformation throughout the process. So the EU's conception of conflict resolution is multi-level. It requires engagement across a wide range of areas and strategies, from security to gender, development, resilience building. Its toolbox spans state building, peace building, support to UN dialogues, trade integration, and refugee assistance. In recent decades, there has been a lot of debate on the role that the EU can play as a conflict resolution actor in its immediate neighborhood, where it holds the carrot of accession. Through its enlargement and association agenda since 2004, the EU has been able to leverage this incentive to push for reforms and peacemaking, especially in its eastern neighborhood, for example, in Bosnia-Herzegovina. Here it has practiced a sticks and carrots approach, incentivizing states that inspire to join the EU to undertake reforms. Here the EU can impose conditionalities and sanctions to ensure compliance, but it can also deploy softer methods, such as socialization into norms. This is what we call the neo-functionalist logic. More globally, in the world, the EU has shown considerable institutional creativity, especially in multi-track diplomacy. While we know that the EU is not really a strong actor in peace enforcement, it has become an inventive actor in mediation. Historically, the EU has engaged in a wide range of mediation strategies, from muscled mediation, mediation support, facilitation in mediation, and problem-solving mediation. One example is the EU's sustained support for the post-conflict national dialogue in Yemen since 2011 that I have been following. There, the EU has deployed significant resources to accompany the transition. Needless to add that the EU has also acted as a reliable partner to the UN in peacekeeping missions. A well-known example that is often evoked in the literature is the Artemis operation in the Ituri region of the Democratic Republic of Congo that is deployed under French leadership. So together, these approaches illustrate the breadth of tools the EU brings to conflict settings, from economic sanctions, diplomacy, mediation, and support operations. For the MENA countries, the Middle East and North Africa, for the MENA countries that are still near the EU, but that do not have the chance of joining the EU launched the European Mediterranean Partnership in 1995 and the ambitious European Neighborhood Agenda, the ENP, in 2004, whereby it linked its conflict resolution approach to a vision of regional burden sharing and joint responsibility. Back then, the EU pledged to assume a greater share of conflict resolution efforts in neighboring countries and promised as well greater political involvement in conflict prevention and crisis management. For example, it vowed to take a more active role in facilitating the resolution of conflicts in Palestine, Israel, or Western Sahara, and to engage in post-conflict governance from security to reconstruction and development. But this rhetoric has not always translated into effective action. As there is an agreement in the literature that divergent member state policies and the EU's tendency to view neighboring conflicts through the lens of its own security have really limited its ability to act coherently. Analysts here have repeatedly pointed to the gap between policy rhetoric and practice and to the constraints that the EU's own security dilemmas impose on its capacity to grow as an effective and reliable conflict resolution actor. This is why, despite its stated commitment to achieving more than mere negative peace, the EU's ambitious rhetoric often materializes in practice as pragmatic conflict management rather than conflict resolution. This approach is really focused on stabilization rather than addressing the root causes of the conflict. In recent Middle Eastern conflicts, the EU has oscillated between partial engagement and disengagement. Its weak capacity to act in Syria's lethal conflict and its ambiguous policymaking in deeply polarizing crises has further undermined its role as an effective and credible actor in the region itself. So while the EU articulates or has been articulating a vision of transformative conflict resolution, the reality on the ground often reflects a more cautious approach, shaped by constraints and by the persistent gap between what it declares and what it can deliver. And this is what I'm interested in. So to unpack these dilemmas more concretely, I'm going to walk you through two regional case studies or case exemplars that illustrate how the EU's behavior in recent conflicts exposes its challenges, its dilemmas, but most importantly, its path dependencies. I'll briefly touch on Syria and Iran and show how each of these two cases reveals different facets of the EU's conflict resolution approach, where it acts, where it hesitates, and where its long-standing legacies continue to shape its present choices. So let me turn to Syria. So the Syria war, I argue, offers really a powerful illustration of how the EU's conflict resolution methods, its disengagement, and its internal dilemmas have shaped the broader conflict landscape. Just to set the scene a little bit, with regards to the Syrian war that lasted 15 years, the EU has taken a multidimensional approach targeting both the war in Syria and its regional spillovers. So let me just give you a brief overview of the main strategies that the EU adopted. So the EU stepped up cooperation with the United Nations on a UN-mediated dialogue in Geneva in line with Resolution 2254. It imposed sanctions on the Syrian regime and supported Syrians affected by the war. So it really supported the UN's multilateral process. It also refused to normalize ties with the Syrian regime, even when the Assad regime proclaimed victory on large swathes of land. At a regional level, it aimed to limit the spread of the Syrian war. Its main objective has been twofold: combat the spread of the Islamic State threat that became acute around 2014 through closer security cooperation, and stabilize neighboring countries through building the resilience of refugee and host communities. So in this context, the EU has been one of the top donors that aim to alleviate the pressure of displacement on regional hosting countries, namely Turkey, Syria, and Lebanon, and to a lesser extent, Iraq and Egypt. It's worth noting here that the EU has positioned its financial aid within a broader foreign and security policy that aims at regional stabilization and resilience building. Let me, however, point out to some of the core policy contradictions here that have weakened EU credibility as a regional conflict resolution actor in Syria's war. Before the fall of the Assad regime in 2024, the EU remained determined in linking the repatriation of refugees to Syria to a political settlement so that refugees can return in dignity and safety. To support this vision, the EU prioritized the continued presence of refugees in neighboring countries. But this approach regionally quickly ran into resistance. Neighboring countries criticized the EU for sharing the burden financially, but not physically, accusing it of throwing money at the problem rather than sharing geographical responsibility. And despite its ambitious stabilization agenda, the EU could not really address the root causes of displacement, i.e., the war itself. Member states remain divided over conflict management efforts, both at the UN and across regional mediation tracks. So Europe continued to hesitate over more assertive involvement for a number of reasons that I will not have time to unpack here, though France did spearhead the Friends of Syria initiative, which sought to unify the opposition, but the effort ultimately failed. Some criticized the EU's reluctance to intervene militarily, even after the reported use of chemical weapons in Syria. Many also argued that the EU's disengagement from the Syrian war and the costs of that disengagement created a regional vacuum. Arguably, this vacuum opened the door for other actors to step in. we saw the rise of multiple parallel tracks, such as the Astana process, led by Turkey, Russia, and Iran. And this created kind of a paradoxical situation in which war makers became peacemakers. This shift pushed the peace process towards a transactional bargaining logic rather than a multilateral and inclusive political settlement in Syria. At the same time, as I hinted earlier, Middle Eastern governments were not happy with what some called the EU's two-faced approach in managing conflict-induced displacement. Outside of the EU member states were reluctant to declare Syria safe for return and thus encouraged refugees to remain in Lebanon, Jordan, and Turkey. Yet, inside of the EU, they sought to reduce their asylum obligations, slow arrivals, and fund containment in the region. So the result was really a contradictory policy landscape when it comes to assessing EU actorness. What is the EU doing? So there was generous funding for refugee hosting in the region, in the Syria region, quote unquote, on the one hand, and migration diplomacy, such as the 2016 EU-Turkey deal, which aimed at preventing onward movement to Europe on the other. So for human rights activists and a civil society that I talked to, this confirmed the dominance of the security-first approach over transformative conflict resolution, something that the EU promotes in its rhetorical diplomacy. Following the fall of the Bashar al-Assad regime, the EU has praised the pragmatism of Syria's new leadership. It has saluted the leadership's openness towards a partnership with Europe as well. And since then, as we know, it has endorsed an approach towards a staged or progressive suspension of economic sanctions to allow for Syria's recovery and reconstruction. And just yesterday, the EU approved the extension of restrictive measures against entities affiliated with the former regime until June 1st, 2027. Yet here, civil society actors and grassroots communities inside Syria fear that international actors and the EU as well will ultimately support a transition that prioritizes security and normalization and order over the political aspirations of Syria's diverse communities. And another unresolved question that looms large is the following. What kind of reconstruction will the EU support? Will it be an investor-oriented process, or will the EU learn from previous legacies and support a post-conflict recovery that genuinely benefits our local communities? At this stage, we simply do not know. So what can we take away from the EU's position in Syria? So I would say that in Syria, the EU stood firmly behind a strategy aiming at limiting the war's spillover effects well before the fall of the Syrian regime. Yet its logic remained closely tied to its own security and stability interests. This raises important questions about the effectiveness of the EU's role in regional conflict resolution and about how a security-first approach, especially in the realm of migration, contributes to the erosion of the EU's normative power in the Middle East and in the Mediterranean. So the EU's approach to Syria reflects a long-standing path dependency of EU engagement in the Middle East. Conflict management and solidarity consistently weighed against border management and security. Taking a different angle, however, one could also argue that the EU is not necessarily a weak or hesitant actor in regional conflicts. It can also be understood as a pragmatic actor that, as some scholars note, manages conflicts and migration from afar, benefiting from the distance that separates it from the conflict zone in the Middle East. One could also argue, however, from another perspective, that the EU is structurally hard-pressed in this context. Beyond the accession card, which it cannot play in the Middle East, it lacks really strong incentives strong pressure tools to entice its regional neighbors towards meaningful conflict resolution. Let me now turn to my second case study, the EU's posture at the outset of the war involving Iran. This case is revealing because it highlights the European Union's hesitant and often reactive approach to conflict resolution, I would argue. But it also signals something deeper, that the EU may now be realizing that the world as it is can no longer be relied upon and that it needs to get its act together. So from the very beginning of the so-called Operation Epic Fury, the EU and its member states made it clear that they did not want to be drawn into what some described as a war of choice rather than a war of necessity. European officials stressed that they had no intention of becoming entangled in a confrontation they neither initiated nor were strategically prepared for. The message was consistent. Europe is overstretched. Europe is focusing on Ukraine. Europe cannot open a second front. Discursively, at least, this framing at the outset of the war justified a posture of disentanglement. German Defense Minister Boris Pistorius captured the stance well. Deeper European involvement, he warned, could drag Europe into a war it cannot control. So this reinforced the argument that the safest option was to remain at arm's length. The Hormuz Strait, one of the world's most sensitive geopolitical choke points, saw virtually until now no European involvement. France, of course, deployed the Charles de Gaulle aircraft carrier, but this was more of a symbolic defensive gesture rather than a strategic commitment. The EU and several member states, including Germany, are currently debating the possibility of sending naval missions, but only once a lasting and sustainable ceasefire is reached, and even then under very strict conditions. Several weeks into the war, European states began to be drawn in indirectly, inextricably, deploying naval assets or allowing their territory to be used by non-combat aircraft. Yet they consistently framed these moves as limited steps aimed solely at regional defense and the protection of their nationals and their assets. As we know, however, the war introduced multiple dilemmas for the EU and its member states. I would like to touch on them briefly. First, EU governments were divided over the legality of the war and whether and to what extent to condemn the operation. These rifts revealed the absence of a unified European position at a critical early stage. Moreover, as the war quickly became entangled with the question of regime overthrow or regime change in Iran, a second dilemma emerged. For the EU, this remains an elephant in the room. Although member states are not supportive of the Iranian regime, they have long disagreed on how to approach it, on whether diplomatic engagement or isolation is the more viable strategy, and EU member states have been divided on that. In this sense, this engagement allowed the EU to avoid taking a clear stance on regime change at a moment when it clearly disapproves of the regime, but does not want to throw its weight behind calls for its quick overthrow in an already very contentious and deeply polarizing conflict. At the same time, the war has heightened the EU's awareness of the need to turn inward and strengthen its internal resilience, its deterrence and autonomy vis-à-vis both its regional and transatlantic partners. So the conflict has revived European fears about spiraling energy prices and dependence on specific energy markets. In many ways, the war's regionalization has acted as a wake-up call, pushing the EU to think more seriously about how to insulate itself from its turbulent neighborhood. So at this stage, I would argue that Europe's primary concern has not been regional conflict resolution or transformation, but rather turning inward and prioritizing insulation and defense. As EU Foreign Policy Chief Kallas put it, this is not Europe's war, but Europe's interests are directly at stake. For Europe, then, keeping the war at arm's length can be interpreted in several ways. First, it signals that the EU is no longer willing to follow the United States blindly into what some view as an irrational war. So when the US administration demanded that allies help unblock the Strait of Hormuz, European governments did not yield. They were clear that they did not want to be drawn into a conflict they neither initiated nor considered strategically necessary for the moment. Second, the EU's internal rifts and hesitant posture reveal a deeper dilemma. And this is something that I would put to the debate. Is this engagement a form of strength, a way of asserting strategic autonomy and acknowledging that the old era of transatlantic alignment is over? Or does this engagement expose a deeper normative vacuum at the heart of the EU? A reluctance to take a position, even when European values, including international law, are clearly at stake. Because while Spain's Foreign Minister José Manuel Alvarez called for a return to the negotiating table, the EU until now has not really played an assertive role in developing a mediation strategy, even though it keeps calling for one. It kept its distance, despite the fact that Europe was once known for its mediation capacity between Tehran and Washington. The silver lining, however, is that the war forged a consensus among many EU member states that had long been divided, a consensus against rash intervention in Iran and the Strait of Hormuz. It pushed the EU to recognize that it must act as a unified actor. So while we may speak today of a transatlantic rupture or rift, there's also a growing realization that the EU can no longer rely on the order it once knew, and that it must avoid entanglement in wars it considers unnecessary, and that overstretch its resources, while at the same time, it should dedicate major attention to boosting its defense readiness. So this is the EU's posture as we speak. Let us not forget really that this convergence came on the heels of a series of confrontations with the American administration over trade wars and other issues in the last month. But the EU's behavior in the Iran war brings us to a core question. Can we still consider today the EU as a global conflict resolution actor, capable of putting its weight behind suppressing conflicts and deploying its full toolbox, ranging from mediation to conflict prevention? Or does the Iran case once again confirm a pattern of hesitation, a reluctance to act even when the very values the European community claims to uphold are clearly at stake? This tension is not new. It's very important to historicize it. As said, it sits at the heart of the EU's identity as a global conflict resolution and security actor. And the Iran case makes this tension even more visible. It shows us an EU that is cautious, overstretched, divided between integration and assertiveness on the international stage, and an actor that is risk averse, but also an EU that has not yet decided what kind of power it wants to be when confronted with asymmetrical, unpredictable, and value-testing conflicts. As I transition into my conclusion, and before I close, I'd like to say a few words about how understanding the EU's conflict resolution capacity is not only about whether and how the EU engages in conflicts or disengages from them. As I try to show in my research, it's also about how the EU manages the spillovers of those conflicts, especially displacement. Increasingly, scholars argue that EU migration policy has become a window into how the EU approaches conflict resolution more broadly. For example, mass displacement from war-torn Syria evolved into one of the most enduring and critical humanitarian crises of our time. While some EU member states, such as Germany and Sweden, adopted generous policies, many others practiced policies of containment. And with the outbreak of the war in Iran, EU leaders rushed to declare that they would take all measures not to reproduce the so-called 2015 migration crisis they faced. So today it's well established that over the last decade, the EU has increasingly turned to containment and externalization in its neighborhood as its main tool for governing regional migration and the spillovers of conflicts. Externalization, as I pointed earlier, refers to the outsourcing of migration responsibility to other actors. And while we often imagine this in terms of building fences, barbed wire, or maritime interceptions, the EU also relies on subtler forms of power, especially migration or refugee diplomacy. Cooperation agreements that encourage non-departure in countries of origin in exchange for financial, political, or development incentives. More and more research points out how these policies harm Europe's ability to act as a force for good in conflict resolution and humanitarian protection. So these policies are often celebrated in Brussels as success stories, yet on the ground they have produced a cascade of negative effects. Externalization is far less effective than policymakers claim. Research shows that EU-backed controls have never fully prevented movement. People simply find new routes. At the same time, externalization has harmed human rights, eroded EU credibility, and sparked grassroots contestation. And I would like to speak briefly about these rippling effects because they affect EU's vision of conflict resolution as it frames it in its rhetorical diplomacy. In Senegal, for instance, activists are challenging EU efforts to discourage migration from West Africa. They are asserting citizens' rights to safe mobility. In 2024, the EU-Mauritania agreement, intended to curb migration to the Canary Islands, triggered unprecedented backlash. Opposition parties and civil society denounced Mauritania's role as Europe's police and the long-term ramifications. Increasingly, we have seen Global South partners push back against cooperation with the EU on its external action. The Gambia, for instance, imposed a short-term ban on EU deportation schemes in 2019, causing a so-called uproar within EU institutions. Research also shows that EU funding partnerships with autocratic regimes often strengthen those regimes' networks at the expense of human security, at the expense of human rights. We see this in Morocco, but also in Tunisia under President Kais Saied, where EU migration policies have been repurposed as political bargaining chips. So, to conclude, analyzing the EU's role in conflict resolution today is, I would say, something of a Pandora's box. We are dealing with long-standing path dependencies, but also deep contradictions. And these contradictions become especially visible when we examine EU engagement across key conflict settings. In Syria, EU disengagement and its focus on refugee containment often came at the expense of addressing the structural drivers of the conflict. And this made the EU prone to contestation in the Middle East and the broader Mediterranean. In Ukraine, debates persist over how the EU can best win not only the war, but also the peace. Angela Merkel, the former German chancellor, has recently criticized the fact that the EU is not making full use of its diplomatic strategy or clout to help end the war on Ukraine. And in Iran, as I try to argue, the EU's ambiguous posture raises question about how and whether the EU can still defend the very European values that are being tested in this war. Through these examples, we see that several dilemmas and long-standing path dependencies shape the EU's trajectory. Whether the EU will turn inward or project its weight outward in conflict resolution, which conflicts to prioritize, and which values it is ultimately willing to defend. And at the end of the day, can we still speak of the EU as a normative power? The hopes were really high. Or has it transitioned into a pragmatic actor that will prioritize security interests at a moment when the world urgently needs human security, development, and humanitarian commitments? What does it mean if the EU too turns inward? And yet, to end, I'd like to end on a positive note. We shouldn't forget what John Hume reminded us, that the EU itself remains one of the finest examples of conflict resolution in history. When speaking about the prospects for peace in Northern Ireland, he invoked Europe's own legacy of reconciliation after centuries of war. So I'd like to stop here, hoping that these insights inspire a broader conversation about what conflict resolution means today and what it could mean in a rapidly changing world order. Thank you so much for listening.
Well, that was a remarkable presentation, and the exposing and walking us through the levels of complexity that are, within this topic that you've so beautifully presented here today. I'm so grateful, not only giving us the broader context, but all of the internal, dilemmas and struggles within the EU and what it meant for Syria and Iran and others as well. I'm just so grateful. I feel like you've broken it down in such a way that makes it really, really quite shockingly, a pivotal moment in our history here. So thank you so much. We have some wonderful questions. And I first want to apologize to everyone if we don't get to them all. We will, I'm sorry, we're going to do our best here. But the first question is, and forgive me if I get your names messed up, but Aliru Abdion Diatu. The question is, what short and long-term strategy can the EU adopt to enhance its own actorness in the global security landscape and its path dependencies on the United States for its own security?
Thank you so much, Donna, for your wonderful remarks. And it was a real pleasure to talk about the EU, although it's very challenging to cover it all. There are so many multifaceted dilemmas. But as I've tried to show, it's very important to talk about these dilemmas and these past dependencies and put them in a broader context to understand the pressures, the inward and the outward pressures that the EU is subject to. Of course, regarding your question, I wanted to say that it's of course it's not an easy moment for the EU to navigate. The EU feels that it stands at a critical juncture. It feels that for such a long time, it has relied on this transatlantic partnership. Also, the alliance through NATO and through multilateral partnerships have for decades asserted and deepened this transatlantic rift. However, for the moment, the EU is at a critical juncture rethinking how to embark on a new era. Some analysts, ironically say that the EU has to let go of, the era of complacency or of free riding, right? What does it mean for the EU? What should the EU do? So the EU, I guess, is in a way facing the moment of ensuring that it can act as a unified actor. that it can, carve convergence when it comes to its foreign policy, although we can see that its foreign policy is exposed to several cracks. What the EU can also do at a broader level is be a consistent actor. And this is something that many scholars and practitioners and civil society activists flag. It's very important for the EU to close the gap between its rhetoric and its practice, especially when it comes to conflict resolution. So I would, if I were to make a first recommendation that is important for the EU at a global regional stage, but also for the EU when it comes to its relationship with the United States, that would be reliability and consistency, and the importance for the EU to close the gap between its rhetoric and the practice so that it regains its actorness in international politics, I would say.
Okay, thank you. Jean Jameson wants to know if the war in Iran strengthened the EU's resolve in the war in Ukraine, and if so, how? And can you enlighten us more about how effective the EU has been in the Ukraine conflict?
Thank you. That's a wonderful question. I guess that it's not easy to give a yes or a no to this question because, on the one hand, some argue that the fact that the EU is now preoccupied, with with the Iran war, that it feels like it doesn't know what to do and how to end the war on Ukraine, or how to position itself vis-a-vis a war that has become, protracted. So at the same time, the EU has been determined in reiterating over and over again that it will not abandon Ukraine, that this is the first front that it wants to attend to. On the other hand, there is the issue of a strategic alignment over Ukraine. Just recently, we know that there is this contentious debate within NATO regarding the depletion of weapons and the supply delays, and how this might affect Ukraine at a time when arms makers are really, privileging the war on Iran. So we see that there is a problem in prioritizing what should come first. There is also the question of whether the EU should really invest more resources and more of its diplomatic clout in ending, the war through negotiation and through credible and a sustainable mediation strategy. This hasn't happened so far, but we see those debates gaining ground in Brussels, in Berlin, and also at the civil society level, because there's also a realization that the EU does not only want to win the war, but also wants to win the peace. And it wants also to mark an era that transitions towards a sustainable peace, because, the war has been, as I tried to demonstrate, groundbreaking for the EU. It has upended or shaken its conflict management rhetoric, the values that it has been defending, also through the EU peacemaking strategy. So it faces right now a critical juncture, and it faces also the challenge of prioritization, what values to prioritize, what strategies to prioritize when it comes to ensuring that the war in Ukraine ends soon. And what can it do also in order not to overstretch its resources and its capabilities in the Middle East? While at the same time, I would just add something that is very important. It is very important that the EU also formulates a clear mediation strategy when it comes to ending the war in Iran. As I said, in the past, the EU, has been known for its mediation capacity between Washington and Tehran, and also in many Middle Eastern conflicts. A lot of people, a lot of analysts feel right now that the EU as a mediation actor has been sidelined. So how can the EU also recover its strategy or its actorness as a credible mediation actor that puts its weight behind ending conflicts ASAP?
Yeah, thank you. This next question is from Jude Antoniappen, and Jude is asking, the EU is generally has shared respect for the territorial sovereignty of its nations. Is one of the factors that lead it to rely on the United Nations framework for conflict resolution and peacekeeping with limited success. Now that the UN is weakened at many fronts, that the United States ostensibly, its currently weakened influence, can the EU anchor its conflict resolution efforts from a regional basis of the impacted nations through agencies such as ASEAN, BRICS, AU, AES, OPEC, and more?
Excellent question. I totally agree with this analysis. As I tried to argue in my presentation today, one cannot assess EU actorness as a conflict resolution actor without looking at the changes within the multilateral world order and the shifts that are occurring right now, because the EU has relied for a long time on multilateralism, or what we call the liberal world order. That is arguably collapsing. There is much talk on alternative strategies. Regional conflict resolution is one of them. You know, many eminent professors, such as Professor Louise Fawcett at Oxford University, are arguing for the return of regionalism, or for strengthening regionalism as a way to ensure that regions are well prepared to resolve and manage conflicts ASAP, because relying on paralyzed institutions, whether we're talking about the Security Council or other multilateral arrangements, has not really produced quick results for people on the ground, and has not been really able to resolve conflicts the way we would like them to see resolved. At the same time, I would like to take this opportunity to call also for institutional creativity at the level of the UN. Many scholars, ask us to look at what the General Assembly is doing. So while we are quick to condemn, for instance, the Security Council, something that we should ask ourselves: how do we also empower the UN? The UN is not only the Security Council. How do we empower the great work that people are doing there, the great organizations such as UNHCR in the Middle East, that has really tried to be a norm entrepreneur while also standing up to multiple challenges on the ground? And how do we ensure that we also stay attuned to the multiple creative strategies that the UNGA has produced or brought forward in the last years, especially during the Syrian war?
Okay, I think we have time for one more question. How can the EU balance the need for a unified, more coherent diplomatic voice with the reality that the individual member states like France and Lebanon often have a deeper access and stronger interests that may not be as deeply shared across the EU? How does distributed diplomacy strengthen rather than weaken the EU as an actor in conflict resolution?
Of course, this is also a wonderful question. Had I had the time, I would have liked to delve into how do we frame the nature of the beast. The EU is really a very interesting organization because it's supposed to act in unison, but it does not. And in the last years, it has been torn between integration, interdependence, and also disintegration. And we have seen this in many critical junctures, including conflicts, but also the so-called 2015 refugee crisis, where the EU could not put its act together and call for burden sharing, refugee quotas, for instance, within the EU, right? So we see a lot of divergences within the EU. Also, when we talk about the EU, we shouldn't forget European member states' colonial legacies and past in the Middle East. So while France, for instance, has a special but also contested relationship with Lebanon, we see that France is currently playing a very proactive conflict management strategy in Lebanon, although sometimes it's not credible. But we see, other member states not really interested in, putting their weight debate behind ending the war in Lebanon ASAP. So, of course, we have to account for these divergences. When we talk about diplomacy, about EU diplomacy, what does it mean? We may talk about EU security and defense policy, we may talk about EU's common foreign and security policy, but at the end of the day, we are talking about diluted diplomacy, distributed diplomacy, and also divided diplomacy among EU member states.
Okay, I think we're going to have to stop there, much to my disappointment. I wish we had another hour to discuss all this with you, but thank you so much. My colleague, Nicole Bryant, is here now from PON and is going to give you an update on current events and what's coming up in the next few weeks.
Thank you so much, Donna. Thank you, Professor Fakhoury. What a wonderful and really fascinating presentation. So we very much appreciate that. To all of our audience members, we are at the conclusion of our annual series of events because next week is commencement here at Harvard. It's very exciting. Students and their families are coming to campus. So if I could get our last slide up, please. We will conclude formally for the academic year. We are, of course, planning a few events over the summer that we will announce very soon. I will note the dates of our fall classes are already online for those considering coming to visit us here in Cambridge or to take a course with the program on negotiation online. Thank you again to all of our community members. We are wishing you very well on this beautiful, extremely summer-like day here in Cambridge. So thank you very much. And until next time, see you soon.
Thank you.